Countries in Asia making concerted efforts to talk Washington into making some concessions as those country-specific tariffs kicked in today. Close U.S. allies and major trading partners, that includes Japan and South Korea, as we heard earlier, scheduling talks with the Trump administration. South Korea's trade minister is in Washington to meet his U.S. counterpart, with Seoul hit with today's additional 25% tariff. Officials say they will prioritize efforts to lower tariff rates in their negotiations. The meeting comes a day after Mr. Trump expressed optimism following a phone call with South Korea's acting president, that's Ahn Dak-soo. The American president saying he sees the possibility of a great deal for both sides. Japan's finance minister, meantime, says upcoming trade negotiations with Washington could include foreign exchange rates. Tokyo has been slapped with 24% reciprocal tariffs. All this on top of a sweeping 10% levy last week. Vietnam's deputy prime minister is set to hold talks with Washington later today. The Southeast Asian nation was hit with some of the highest tariff rates in the region at 46%. Fears are rising over repercussions on jobs and wages. ASEAN chief Dr. Kao Kim Hourn urging the grouping to act boldly to increase economic integration. He was speaking ahead of a meeting of ASEAN economic and finance ministers where fallout from Washington's new levies topped the agenda. Meantime, industry experts warning that any measures taken must take into account longer-term impacts.
Economies really need to think very much on the long term, I would say. Short term wise, of course, there's going to be some very difficult conversations and some very difficult decisions that need to be made so that businesses can survive and economies can survive. But on the other hand, we got to think long term about relationships and reputations.
And for more, CNA's Melissa Goh joins us live from the Kuala Lumpur Convention Centre. Melissa, the ASEAN chief urging the bloc to rally and to deepen its integration at the ASEAN Investment Conference. The bloc bracing for the impact, or it has already been hit by those tariffs from the United States. What else did the ASEAN chief share?
Well, speaking after the higher U.S. tariff kicked in for all the ASEAN member countries, ranging from 10% to 49%, with Cambodia and Vietnam being the hardest hit. Given its labor-intensive manufacturing industries export a lot to the U.S., now their shipments are immediately slapped with almost 50% tariffs. Now, ASEAN Secretary General Dr. Kao made the urgent call ahead of ASEAN finance ministers meeting on Thursday to double down on economic integration, he said, and expand intra-ASEAN trade that remains low at below 25%, despite 10 years since the ASEAN Economic Community was launched. Now, member countries must move beyond rhetoric, he said, and push to integrate their markets and create the economies of scales by removing tariffs and non-tariff restrictions on trade, services and investment, including movement of labor and capital. Now, while the world is turning inwards, ASEAN must remain an open and stable economic bloc, a region that continues to embrace and uphold multilateralism. Now, diversify from traditional markets is key by forging alliances with other trade blocs in the Middle East, in South America, and so on. There must be genuine efforts, he said, in execution. Now, ASEAN, with a combined GDP of almost $3.8 trillion and a population of almost 700 million, is a force to be reckoned with and must get its act together. Let's take a listen.
Our economic fortune, once voiced by globalization, can no longer be taken for granted. Without urgent and collective action to accelerate intra-ASEAN economic integration and diversify our markets and partnerships, we risk ceding our place in a fractured and fast-evolving global economy. We must act boldly, decisively, and together to reaffirm ASEAN's commitment to a stable, predictable, and business-friendly environment.
Now, combined, ASEAN countries have a huge trade surplus of about $126 billion with the US. Now, they have disputed the basis for calculation used by the US in determining the import tariffs. It's punitive, it's unfair, they said, and it's going to hurt the economy, not to mention the job losses.
Melissa, of course, ASEAN doing what it can, where it can, so it can unite, it can deepen its own economic integration. But it's also making its own efforts to reach out to the Trump administration.
Indeed. I mean, for starters, all the ASEAN member countries, they agreed that retaliation is not the way to go. The markets are small. Now, many are starting or planning to begin dialogues with the US. Now, as we speak, various task forces are assessing the sectoral impact in their countries before sending their delegations to the US to try negotiate to lower the tariffs by offering some forms of concessions. Now, Vietnam, Indonesia, for example, they have offered zero tariffs on some of the US imports and pledged to buy or invest more in the US. It's not something that ASEAN member countries should rush into individually. Prime Minister Anwar stressed here at the ASEAN Investment Conference. Now, it's something that they should tread carefully. There's a lot of experts here are saying. Let's take a listen.
Because the situation is complex, we just have to see. You know, as there's a Chinese saying, you know, 走一步看一步, you know, right? So you have to watch it as it unfolds. But ultimately, I think the question is who bears the pain and how big is the pain, and then who blinks first.
So is it going to be permanent, or is this just a negotiating tactic by Trump administration to squeeze as much as possible from the member countries? You know, only time will tell. Until then, they're buckling up because the trade war looks set to escalate.
Thanks, Melissa Go reporting live from Kuala Lumpur as ASEAN looks at how it can respond to these tariffs from Washington.